And now that the Taliban is in power, it really means that Afghanistan has been excluded from the geopolitics of South Asia, because no country in the region, no country anywhere has recognized the Taliban. As you know, it's a rather tumultuous moment for Bangladesh's politics now, as the election fast approaches, which is scheduled for January of next year, and we've seen tensions between just how much Bangladesh has become a battleground for great power competition. Bangladesh's relations with India are complex. These days, they're very good. They're very strong, and I think that's partly because there are a number of ideological convergences between the Awami League, the ruling party in Bangladesh, and the BJP in India. And Prime Minister Hasina, Prime Minister Modi share a lot of things in common in terms of their views about certain things, and they seem to get along quite well. Most of the countries in the region have good relations with Russia, and clearly what the U.S. has sought to do is to try to get to try to get the capitals in the region to take a stronger stand against Russia. Have China, Russia, and Iran comprising almost a quarter of the countries in this group, and that's enough for many people to say, yes, this is going to be an anti-West bloc. Many countries, first of all, feel that great power competition is putting them in a tough spot. Maybe they feel pressure that they're being pressured to move too close to the West or to the United States, and they want an alternative, and that's to join this other group that's led by the powers outside of the West, China and Russia and so on.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Timesglo podcast. Today we are pleased to have Mr. Michael Kugelman on our show, who is a director at South Asia Institute with Woodrow Wilson Center. How are you doing, Michael?
I'm doing very well, thanks. Good to be here with you.
Thanks for joining. I've heard that you had COVID recently. So how are you feeling now?
Well, thanks for checking in. Luckily, I'm doing fine. Fortunately, it was not one of those longer, more chronic cases. So thanks for asking. But I think it's a reminder that the pandemic is not yet over.
Yeah, glad to hear that. Michael, you were quite recently, you were in Bangladesh. So you visited the country that have, we have a shared history with that country, and that's a growing economy as well. So how was your experience, and what were the key takeaways from your trip, especially Bangladesh economic development and regional relations?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It was a great trip to Bangladesh. I was there for a series of conferences and meetings, including one that focused on the new Indo-Pacific Outlook document that the Bangladesh government recently came out with. I thought that for me, being there brought home the fact that it's a very key moment for Bangladesh, both in terms of its domestic politics, but also geopolitically. As you know, it's a rather tumultuous moment for Bangladesh's politics now, as the election fast approaches, which is scheduled for January of next year, and we've seen tensions between the ruling party and the opposition pick up, and there were a number of political protests taking place while I was there. And for me, the big takeaway on that front was that no one outside of the ruling party membership and support base seems to think that the election will be a free and fair one, and that raises some questions about what the consequences of that could be. And of course, the U.S. government has been rather robust and vocal, as you know, in criticizing the state of democracy and rights there. So that was interesting. But I think what really stood out for me even more is just how much Bangladesh has become a battleground for great power competition. There's three actually that are playing out there now, as I see it. One is the India-China competition, which of course has been a long-standing one. Also, the U.S.-China competition is playing out there. The U.S. is much more present in Bangladesh than it had been some years ago, and a big reason for that is it's trying to scale up influence to try to get Bangladesh to be a bit more reliant on China. And then also the U.S.-Russia rivalry is coming to Bangladesh. Bangladesh, I guess, like a number of countries in South Asia, including India for sure, and Pakistan, has good relations with Russia. And I think the U.S. is concerned about that, to put it mildly. So yeah, it was just a very interesting visit to see that Bangladesh is a place that I think deserves a lot more strategic focus than it gets in many capitals, including in Washington. But just a very interesting visit. So thanks for asking about it.
Okay, all right. So, you have been in Bangladesh, but do you think that how the Bangladesh was separated, that emotional, that part of the history, that emotional legacy, does it shape the Bangladesh foreign policy and impacts its foreign policy with the regional powers like Pakistan, regional countries within the South Asia?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it was very clear to me, not to state the obvious, but it was very clear to me when I was there that the legacy and the impact of 1971 continues to play out very vividly in Bangladesh. And I think that, to be sure, this is in part for political reasons. The ruling party in Dhaka regularly, if not on a daily basis, invokes 1971 and what happened in its speeches and its deliberations and so on. I think some of that is political, but clearly the trauma, the raw emotions associated with that incredibly difficult year, these certainly linger. And since this was only this is less than 60 years ago, right? It wasn't that long ago. Many people in the country were there and experienced it, and I think that has an impact as well. Clearly, this has had a continued impact on Bangladesh's relationship with Pakistan, and it seems to me that if there's any chance of strengthening relations between Dhaka and Islamabad, so long as the current ruling party stays in power in Bangladesh, I think that they would demand that there be some type of apology from Pakistan for its role in 71. I don't see that coming, quite frankly. So that clearly is a clear link right there in terms of what happened in 71 and how Bangladesh sees its relations with Pakistan evolving, which are in great part linked to 71. Bangladesh's relations with India are complex. These days, they're very good. They're very strong, and I think that's partly because there are a number of ideological convergences between the Awami League, the ruling party in Bangladesh, and the BJP in India. And Prime Minister Hasina, Prime Minister Modi share a lot of things in common in terms of their views about certain things, and they seem to get along quite well. And of course, there is that recognition that in 71, India did help Bangladesh. So I think that it's obviously a very delicate, controversial matter to discuss. I try not to throw myself into these discussions that much, but indeed, it is true as well that India became more actively involved in that conflict only at the very end of it. So very complex, very delicate. But I think it's, for an outside analyst like me, it's important to talk to as many people, get as many perspectives as I can. When I was there, I spoke to a number of supporters of the ruling party who certainly had a perspective on 71. And then I also talked to critics of the current government in Bangladesh who had somewhat of a different perspective on 71. But final thing I'll say is that I had the opportunity to visit a relatively new museum in Dhaka, the Liberation War Museum, it's called. And I think it's very helpful for anyone, quite frankly, to learn a lot more about 71. I find that this is something that, for me, is one of the seminal moments of the geopolitical history of South Asia post 47. And yet, honestly, you don't hear that much about it. Even here in the United States, people don't talk that much about it. There was a very famous, well-regarded book that came out a few years ago, Blood Telegram, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which was about essentially the U.S. role in 71 and how it was backing Pakistan. It was a huge success. I think it won a lot of awards, and then people were talking about 1971. But still, many outside of the region, outside of South Asia, I think, don't really talk about it as much as they should. So I certainly recommend that any visitor, no matter what your political perspectives may be, should visit that museum. It was very interesting.
So it's interesting here as well that people are talking about 1971 with the current political situation in Pakistan. So they are saying that one should be, aware of the consequences of the current political crisis in Pakistan, and it can happen. That's a delicate issue to talk about here as well, but people do talk about it. So let's move towards the evolving geopolitics in South Asia. First of all, I would like you to talk about the shift switching of the US from Afghanistan towards if we see the BRICS and addition of more countries into inclusion of more countries into the BRICS, especially some of US allies as well, like US allies. I wouldn't say US. They having good relations with the US. What is your takeaway of US shifting away from Afghanistan and strategy to counter China in the Pacific?
Yeah, it's a great question. The last 2 years have seen all types of geopolitical shifts in South Asia. And I think one of them certainly is, not only did the U.S. leave Afghanistan, but it left Afghanistan under the control of the Taliban. And now that the Taliban is in power, it really means that Afghanistan has been excluded from the geopolitics of South Asia because no country in the region, no country anywhere has recognized the Taliban regime. So I think it strikes a big blow for prospects for regional integration, which are always quite slim anyway because of the India-Pakistan problem. But obviously, Afghanistan, I assume, it cannot hold its seat in SARC. It cannot participate in any types of formal diplomatic conversations with other South Asian nations. So that clearly is significant. But yes, absolutely. President Biden made very clear when he was explaining why he decided to leave. He was very blunt. He said that we have bigger priorities elsewhere, and one of those priorities for him is U.S.-China competition. And in my view, we have seen a major shift in terms of how the U.S. policy has been pursued in South Asia since the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. I would argue that for a number of decades, the U.S. looked at South Asia through several very narrowly defined lenses. One was Afghanistan focused, waging the war in Afghanistan. The other, which emerged more in the mid part of the 2000s and certainly in the early 2010s, was building out a deep partnership with India. And then third was trying to figure out ways to manage to have a good relationship with Pakistan, which I think was linked to some degree to the war in Afghanistan. I think that over those years the U.S. was waging that war in Afghanistan, it wanted a good relationship with Pakistan, but the main reason it wanted a good relationship was its hope that it could develop enough trust and goodwill with Pakistan that Islamabad would be willing to help the U.S. pursue its objectives in Afghanistan. And that did not work out very well, at least from a U.S. perspective. But that changed. That's all changed over the last 2 years. I've seen U.S. officials now looking at South Asia more broadly as a geographic whole, not just through these three silos: war in Afghanistan, partnership with India, workable relations with Pakistan. Is much broader. And this is good because I think South Asia deserves that broader geographic strategic look. But the lens that the US is using as it looks at South Asia is certainly a China lens. And so we've seen over the last few years, and really going back to the last few months of the Trump administration, efforts by the US to deepen engagement with pretty much every country in South Asia, other than Afghanistan. A key moment, the very end of the Trump administration, one of its last big moves that it made on Asia policy is that it announced that it was going to open a U.S. embassy in the capital of Maldives. Now, Maldives is not a country that got a lot of strategic attention in Washington from 2001 to 2021, but Maldives, of course, is one of the many countries in the region where China has developed more influence. So clearly the U.S. has tried to step up engagement and strengthen relations with countries around the region. not to try to get them to jump into the U.S. camp, so to speak. I think that's a misconception. But more so, the goal here is to try to develop enough of a sufficient substantive relationship with these countries in the region that they do not feel compelled to throw their throw their full weight over to China for economic reliance. In other words, the U.S. does not want the countries of South Asia to become fully reliant commercially on China because of the BRI issue. So that's where we are today. So as a result, you see these high-level U.S. delegations visiting places like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, and Nepal. These visits would not have been made some years ago. And I would say, final note, yes, China is the main lens through which the U.S. looks at South Asia these days. But I would argue that since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's a Russia lens too. As I think I had said before, the U.S. knows that half the SAARC countries have abstained from many of the UN resolutions condemning the invasion. Most of the countries in the region have good relations with Russia, and clearly, what the U.S. has sought to do is to try to get to try to get the capitals in the region to take a stronger stand against Russia. The U.S. gives India some free passes on that front because of its deep relationship with India. Ironically, India probably has closer relations with Russia than any other country in the region, but it's India that gets the most free passes from the U.S. And again, that's for strategic reasons. So yeah, we've seen some pretty significant shifts in terms of how the U.S. has focused on South Asia since the pullout from Afghanistan.
Michael, okay, the great power competition in South Asia that have implications uh, for the region as well. Okay, if United States is trying to pull the strings of the countries, like you were mentioning, the Maldives, were trying to interact with the countries like Sri Lanka in the South Asia, except for the Afghanistan. So the if I take you back to the BRICS development, and India is vouching for some of the major countries like Egypt and UAE, that the UAE and Saudi Arabia, that is part that have good relations with the with the United States. Do you think that there is this BRIC is going to be an anti-Western bloc?
Well, I mean, given the new members that are going to be coming in, I really don't think that will be the right term to use, though many would disagree. I mean, the fact that Iran is one of the new members means that you're going to have China, Russia, and Iran comprising, almost a quarter of the countries in this group, and that's enough for many people to say yes, this is going to be an anti-West bloc. But I don't think we're there yet. I mean, the other members that are joining are actually quite friendly with the West. I mean, you look at the UAE and Saudi Arabia, Egypt. Egypt gets a huge amount of financial assistance from the U.S., and of course, the Gulf countries, the Arab Gulf countries, value their energy relations with the U.S. and the West, and they won't want to be a part of an anti-West bloc for sure. Now, the question is, will there be more expansion? There may be. And then, if you have a situation where more members come in that do want to be part of an effort to counter the West, then that's when you have to start being concerned. The other point I'd make here is that the BRICS has been very inefficient. It has a lot of good ideas, but there's not a lot of consensus, and there hasn't been a common vision, and that's made it hard for this group to actually be impactful on the ground, so to speak. It's had trouble implementing its ideas. And there certainly is a new BRICS bank, which I think is meant to serve as a counter to the Western-led economic institutions, but there's not much to it. And finally, I think that we shouldn't overstate this idea of entities like BRICS trying to sideline or displace these Western-led economic models, just because it's very difficult to decouple from that. For all this talk about de-dollarization mechanisms, whether in the BRICS or SCO or elsewhere, the dollar remains quite dominant in the global economy. It's going to be difficult to move away from that, which I think is the same argument one can use when some people talk about the need to decouple from China's economy. Certainly many China hawks in the West who think that it's time to stop engaging with, stop trading with China. You can't do that. There's such a deep Chinese investment footprint and trade footprint around the world. You just can't get rid of that. I mean, and you look at how, for instance, the U.S. trade with China has continued to be robust. India's trade with China has continued to be robust over the last few years. So, the bottom line answer to your question is, I don't think BRICS is becoming an anti-West bloc, but even if it moves toward that with more countries that are avowedly anti-West, we shouldn't overstate just how much this group can get done. And so, at the least or at the most, you'd be looking at a group that reputationally, in terms of optics, seems anti-West and maybe rhetorically would be anti-West down the road. But since it would probably have trouble getting things done, especially moving from 5 members to 11 or even more, I don't think on operational levels it would really pose that threat to these Western-led economic models, at least not in the near to medium term.
But what is the motivation behind so many countries joining the BRICS? Especially, they think that there have been inequalities the neoliberal, economic model have given to the world, and most of the countries from the global south have been ignored.
Well, I think that they're looking for alternatives, and that's an alternative is not necessarily something that should be seen as confrontational to the West. I mean, clearly, many countries, first of all, feel that great power competition is putting them in a tough spot. Maybe they feel pressure that they're being pressured to move too close to the West or to the United States, and they want an alternative, and that's to join this other group that's led by, the powers outside of the West, China and Russia and so on. And I think it also may be a view that maybe there could be economic benefits to joining up with a non-Western model, thinking that the Western-led economic mechanisms have not benefited their countries, their governments economically, and they feel that perhaps if this BRICS bank gets off the ground, there could be opportunities there, which again would be meant to focus on economic strength more so than trying to declare a hostile campaign against the United States.
All right. So India's moving from non-alignment to multi-alignment foreign policy, and they are, as you have already mentioned, they have very good relations with Russia. Now they are having, they are part of Quad. They have good relations with the US. Do you think they would be easily able to, balance their relations between these two major powers?
Well, to this point they have. I mean, the fact of the matter is, today it's been, a year and a half or so since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and India's relations with both the US and Russia are just as good as they were beforehand. And that's saying something, given that, India, of course, has, very clearly indicated that it's not going to criticize the invasion. It is not going to take a stronger stand against Russia. It's not going to take any type of stand against Russia. And the U.S., of course, has not been happy about that, but it's accepted that, and it has not hurt its relations with between India and the U.S. And meanwhile, even as India has continued to move closer to the United States and increase its defense cooperation with the U.S. and move closer to the Quad countries, that hasn't hurt its relations with Russia. Of course, Russia needs India. It needs India to keep buying its oil, its energy, for sure. But I think that's an indication right there that India has been able to continue to manage its relations with both of these countries. But a few points on that front. I would argue that the future trend lines of India's relations with the U.S. are much more predictable and stable than the future trend lines for its relationship with Russia. I mean, we've seen this linear development of India moving closer and closer to the U.S. Its share of arms imports from the U.S. have increased. It's just doing more with the U.S. Military to military cooperation has increased. Its relationship with the U.S. has continued to expand to areas from tech to higher education cooperation. Whereas with India's relationship with Russia, it's there, India is keen to maintain that relationship, but I would argue that it's much more narrowly focused. At this point, it's essentially focused on energy trade and other commercial relations as well. India does continue to import Russian arms, but that could get tougher to do. If Russia continues to get bogged down in this war, it may not have the capacity to manufacture the types of weaponry, the high level weaponry that India has been dependent on for so long. Finally, there could be a tipping point. There could be a trigger point. I mean, let's say, worst case scenario, Russia expands its war into Poland, into a NATO country. Or let's say, my goodness, I hope it doesn't come to this. The war becomes a nuclear war. I think that if you have scenarios like that, especially the latter one, well, I think India is going to be under unprecedented amounts of pressure from the U.S. to essentially move on from Russia, so to speak. I don't want to seem like a scaremongerer here. I'm not trying to say that these worst case scenarios are going to play out, but there could, you can't rule out the possibility that there is this contingency, this scenario where India does have to choose, so to speak, does have to choose a side. The U.S. doesn't want to do that. It's not going to do that for now, but you can't rule that out down the line.
In China, US is in economic war with China. If I don't, if I'm not I would like to ask for my forgiveness from my audience if I'm not if I'm using a wrong word. Economic war with the China, and strategically, US is trying to surround uh, China in its Indo-Pacific region. If you were right that just like India, Bangladesh is also coming into Indo-Pacific strategy and have good relations with US. So how do you see? I would like your point of view on uh, in Bangladesh moving from its non-alignment to its alignment policy towards the US. So what implications would that have for Bangladesh?
Yeah, so I think that India continues to be non-aligned. I mean, maybe you could say it's multi-aligned too. In some senses, it's the same thing, right? If you have so many alignments, that means there's no one alignment at the end of the day. Um, and India has, let's be very clear, India has continued to pursue a relationship with Beijing. Certainly, strategically, it's its biggest competitor, it's its biggest concern, it's its biggest long-term security threat. India is very concerned about China's capacities along the northern border with India. But I think that the India-China relationship is a great case study of how countries with fraught, at times hostile, conflicted relations can still find ways to get along. And I think there could be some lessons for Pakistan and India here. India and China have continued to have this robust commercial relationship, even after the border clash in 2020, when relations fell to their lowest level since they had gone to war in the 70s. I mean, the trade volume figures are remarkable. I mean, if you look at the last year or so, India's trade volume with China has been just short of India's trade volume with the U.S. It really is something. India did decide to ban dozens, perhaps hundreds of Chinese apps soon after that border clash, which it cited as a security mechanism, fearing surveillance risks and so on. But that's it. I mean, the commercial relationship has remained alive, and I think that so long as that continues, I think that means that you could count on there being enough trust and goodwill to ensure that the relationship more broadly can continue to stumble along. Also, the fact that you have periodic, in fact, monthly dialogues, high-level military dialogues between the two countries to discuss the border issue. That's also, I think, very, very notable, very significant. So, and for all we talk about the India, being a part of this Indo-Pacific Quad, which has got a lot of momentum now and is doing all kinds of things. There's still places India will not go. It will not sign any type of mutual defense pact with the U.S. or any other country. It would not fight wars alongside other countries. It would not deploy troops to fight alongside the U.S. It would not expect the U.S. to send troops to the northern border if India got into a war with China. So there's things that India won't do in that regard. So I think this is the model that Bangladesh would want to follow. Though I should say Bangladesh has been, I think, even more careful than India. Bangladesh has a pretty good relationship with China and with India and with Russia. Bangladesh's Indo-Pacific outlook is not, in my view, a formal endorsement of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. It's more its own effort to really signal that it buys into some of the principles behind the Indo-Pacific strategy, but not all of them. I've written about this. I talked about this in Bangladesh last week. If you read the Indo-Pacific Outlook document, it underscores principles that are found in the U.S. strategy. Free, open, inclusive, that type of thing. But it also emphasizes principles like non-interference, sovereignty, and these are the catchphrases that China likes to use in its policy documents about international relations. And finally, it's not an Indo-Pacific strategy; it's an Indo-Pacific outlook, which conveys, has a softer connotation, and I think is meant to indicate that it's not a formal endorsement of the
That was clearly mentioned. The outlook word was clearly mentioned.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, Michael, where do you see Pakistan in this great power competition? With the domestic politics, the domestic economic issues at Pakistan.
Well, I mean, I think that the conventional wisdom and perhaps the reflexive response would be that Pakistan is not really a big part of this great power competition, just because it has a special relationship with China, and that there's an assumption that the U.S. Can't really try to wean Pakistan away from China because Pakistan is all in with China, and that is true to an extent. But you look at how the U.S. Well, there's a separate issue of the domestic political situation and how that plays into U.S.-Pakistan relations. We could talk about that, but if you look at U.S.-Pakistan relations,
there was this Cypher issue that I wanted to discuss with you as well, but we have shifted towards BRICS. We will move towards Cypher at the end of our discussion.
Okay, sure. But what I was saying about geopolitics is that I talked earlier how U.S. officials want to strengthen relations with countries around the region so that they're not fully reliant on China. You are seeing U.S. officials try to pitch potential alternatives, infrastructure investments, other forms of assistance to counter what China is doing in Pakistan. And it may seem like a lost cause, and it probably is, because China, of course, is so present and entrenched in Pakistan with CPEC, of course. But going back to the rather, some would say famous, some would say infamous speech that Alice Wells made at the Wilson Center, where I work, 4 years ago. This is when she was she had the position that Donald Lu has now at the State Department. She gave this very detailed explanation of how the U.S. could do investments better in Pakistan than China does. And of course, she emphasized things like transparency, equitability, and so on. And now what we've seen in more recent years is the U.S. has tried to use the Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, a relatively new government agency, as a tool to basically sponsor new infrastructure investments in Indo-Pacific countries. And it's already announced a few new projects in India, not as much in Pakistan, but it is notable that last summer, when you had Dilawar Syed, who at the time was the top State Department official focused on investment, he made a long trip to Pakistan, and he brought with him senior leaders from the DFC to discuss potential investments. So this is all meant to push back against what China is doing, though I don't think that you can't really hold a candle to what China is up to in Pakistan. But yeah, so I think Pakistan, I mean, this is my sense as an outsider. It does not want to be seen as all in with China. It wants to balance its relations with both China and with Pakistan, with China and the United States. That might not have been as much the perspective of Imran Khan when he was in power, But I think that the government that just left, and I certainly think the establishment, the military in Pakistan would feel that way as well. And we actually saw, since the ouster of Khan, of course, this just gives rise to more conspiracy theory type comments, that there were moves made by Islamabad to try to strengthen relationships, the relationship with the United States. So, short answer is that I think that there's only so far the U.S.-Pakistan relationship can go because of Pakistan's close relationship with China. But Washington is trying to do what it can, to try to gain some benefits from the strategic rivalry with China by at least proposing some alternatives to Pakistan, to drive it away, even if only modestly, from China and its infrastructure investments.
Okay, what are your views on this Cypher controversy in Pakistan?
Well, I mean, yeah, there's so much one can say about it. I think it's really actually a very interesting reflection of U.S.-Pakistan relations and how they've evolved over the years. I mean, this is a relationship where we have seen in the past, the U.S. undertaking covert operations. There was a time when you had large numbers of U.S. spies in Pakistan. There was a very large intelligence presence there during the Cold War. And, given that there was so much of that, and obviously it was by definition opaque, it was always hard to know exactly what was going on. Naturally, there's a tendency for many in Pakistan to be suspicious about what the U.S. was up to. And I have to say that and this doesn't get enough attention, the fake hepatitis B campaign. I cannot overstate enough the impact that has had on the relationship in the more recent past. I mean, the fact that you have the CIA working with the Pakistani doctor to hatch this fake vaccination campaign to track down bin Laden, I can imagine that would just scale. It would send suspicion of U.S. motives and policy intentions in Pakistan to the stratosphere. And so, in that sense, when you have this cable, recounting this conversation between Donald Liu and the then Pakistani ambassador, that when people in Pakistan hear that Liu had said that things would be better for the relationship if Khan was gone, or whatever, I don't know if those are his exact words, that many would assume that had to mean that Liu and others in the U.S. government were behind were colluding in this effort to oust Khan. It's not true. That is my very strong view. But I could understand, given the history, and given the mistrust and the tendency to assume the worst about U.S. policies among many there in Pakistan, that people would believe that this was an indication of a U.S. coup or regime change involving the United States. But I think that it's a very interesting case study. I'll put it that way. A very nice case study for U.S.-Pakistan relations.
Okay. Where do you see? I'm just directly, putting close-ended questions. Where do you see the relations between India and Pakistan when there are elections coming up in both of the countries, and what role the elections play, and what the domestic vote bank buys for both of the countries? Where do you see the relations in near future?
Right. Of course, yeah, there's an election in India next spring. We don't know when the election in Pakistan will happen, but we assume it will happen soon enough, hopefully by early next year.
We have to do the elections in 90 days.
Yes, exactly. Hopefully that's what'll happen.
But that is yet to be announced.
Okay. Well, great. I'm not optimistic about India-Pakistan relations. I mean, I don't think that they're on a spiral. I think that they're experiencing perhaps an uneasy stability right now, in the sense that neither side is keen to extend an olive branch. Certainly not India. I mean, we've seen that the BJP, I think, believe that it got some election boosts from talking tough on Pakistan on the campaign trail. And of course, we know that the Balakot crisis came soon before the election, and that was something that Modi and other BJP leaders exploited on the campaign trail, and Modi won in a landslide. course, he won re-election for many reasons, not just because of talking tough on Pakistan. But yeah, so this is not the moment when India would want to extend an olive branch. And I think that from the New Delhi's perspective, or from the BJP's perspective, they tried. Their argument is that they tried when Modi made that surprise visit to Lahore. Not long after after Modi became prime minister, he made that visit. He made an outreach, and then there was that attack not very long after. And I think that for the BJP, the idea is that we tried, didn't work. We're not going to try again. Sort of a once bitten, twice shy effect. And some have made this argument that Modi could pull off a Nixon goes to China type of affair. In other words, Modi has the popularity and the political capital where he could take a risk, and he could be the guy. He could be the, even though he's a hardliner, he could be the guy that tries to try again. But again, I think the view there is that they tried once, they're not going to try again. And I think also with the uncertainty in Pakistan, and with the uncertainty about the election schedule, I just don't think there's any desire to focus on improving the relationship. And on the Pakistan side, I know there's been a lot of messaging about how there's desire to bury the hatchet and move on from the problems of the past. But my understanding is that the precondition to any type of outreach or dialogue with India would be that Kashmir-related issues, that India revoke its decision to revoke Article 370, which India is not going to do. And so I think that that's why we're stuck for the most part. And it's unfortunate because we live in an era when it's never been more important for the two countries to get along. I mean, these shared borderless threats like climate change and pandemics, if they had a better relationship, that would have helped matters. And when Pakistan had those terrible floods last summer, I know there had been some initial talk about trying to resume some limited border trade to help Pakistan's food insecurity, but nothing came of that. There was a SARC effort during the pandemic led by Modi to try to get South Asia to work together, to put together joint efforts to counter the pandemic. India and Pakistan weren't willing to agree to that. So yeah, it's a shame. I don't think things will get worse necessarily, but I don't see things getting better.
Okay, Michael, you have talked about the climate change and the impact of climate change on different countries. Especially South Asia is more prone to climate change, and we have seen the worst floods. We still now, like yesterday, there was this storm in Islamabad that we have never seen before. And the floods on the banks of Satluj River that's happening. Bahawalpur there is a flood in Bahawalpur that has never been before, because that's a desert area, part of it with the Satluj. So and this climate change would definitely impact the relations between the countries, and the seriousness of the countries, about this issue. So how do you see the future of the South Asia, the climate change impacting this, especially the future of the future of the South Asia?
Well, I mean, if there's one strong incentive that should give every country in the region a reason to sit up and say, let's find a way to work together, it would be climate change, right? I mean, climate change on the whole is borderless, but if you look at the different types of effects, right, air pollution, or if you're talking about floods, and more broadly, transboundary river issues, glacial melt, and so on. I mean, this is inherently cross-border in nature. So, if in an ideal world, if you're looking for a way to revitalize SARC, it would be through climate change, or the imperative of working together to respond to climate change. But I just don't see that being. I don't see there being a mood for that, quite frankly. I mean, if anything, we've seen the sub-regionalization dynamics at play in South Asia. India has sought to move away from Pakistan and try to focus on BIMSTEC, which of course is another regional organization, but it does not count Pakistan or Afghanistan as members. So it's very unfortunate, but again, climate change it's not a long-term abstract threat. It's very much here. I mean, you laid out the very vivid examples of how Pakistan has been experiencing it so intently just over the last few weeks, the last few months, and these same things play out in just about every country in the region. And South Asia is one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world, but unfortunately, I just don't know if that would serve as a wake-up call to the region to find a way to develop greater pathways for cooperation. I hope I'm wrong, and maybe 5-10 years down the road, the geopolitical dynamics will have changed, and that could create some pathways for cooperation. But one cannot be complacent about this climate change threat.
I was looking at the Burning Man that the people were stranding over there, more than 70,000. How is the situation? I haven't been following that today or yesterday. What's the situation there?
Yeah, I haven't been following that, to be honest with you. I actually not pride myself. I tried not to focus that much on U.S. domestic politics, and mainly just because my job is to be a foreign policy analyst. So yeah, I don't really know what's going on with that. I've seen some headlines in the press, but otherwise, I haven't really been following it. So sorry about that.
It's okay. So, what's exactly do you focus on the South Asia foreign policy towards the U.S.?
Sorry. Yes. Yeah. I focus on U.S. policy in South Asia. I also focus on the dynamics and geopolitics of South Asia and the relations between South Asian countries, and certainly the impacts of all that on U.S. policy.
All right. So thank you so much, Michael, for your time. I tried my best to, speak in the best way because, my English is not that good. Hopefully, I made my points well and I asked good questions.
No, no, you were terrific, and your English is much better than my Urdu or my Hindi or whatever the case may be. So you have nothing to worry about. This is a great discussion.
Thank you so much. It was nice to have you. Inshallah, we'll have another discussion in future.
Inshallah, absolutely. It would be great to come back another time soon. But thanks again for a great discussion.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Take care.